everybody, and welcome to Zeitguys, a podcast focused on the creation and analysis of culture. We hope to discuss a variety of fields such as literature, film, music, and so on, but today we will be discussing Guillermo del Toro's adaptation of Frankenstein. And I am your host, Hal Geary, along here with my co host, Gallo.
How you doing?
Yes, so for this film, obviously, Frankenstein started as a novel by Mary Shelley. It was published in, I believe, 1816. And since then, it's become one of the most iconic Gothic horror stories in its various adaptations in that to the point now where it is no longer just the book. It is a a bigger story like Sherlock Holmes or Dracula. Those are other stories that are beyond their original form at this point. And so we're not really going to be discussing the film and how it holds up as an adaptation of the novel, even though we will touch on that a bit. We're going to discuss it mainly as a adaptation that captures the general ethos of Frankenstein as it exists kind of in the popular consciousness and in the culture in general. Although it is worth noting, Del Toro, the director, had long wanted to do a accurate version of Frankenstein, an accurate adaptation of the novel, because anyone who's familiar with the other adaptations will know they take quite a few creative liberties, though at the same time Del Toro's does. And in a different interview, he also stated he didn't want to be too constrained by doing too closely to the book. So that's a bit of mixed messaging there. But yes, as for the film itself, there are significant changes. Like just in the background, the novel is set in the at the end of the 18th century, in probably the 1790s or so, whereas it's set in the 1850s, so the mid 19th century in the film. Gallo, if you wanted to say anything
I just
more.
wanted to, I just wanted to expand on your point there, but what Frankenstein actually is, even in modern day, when you compare it to Sherlock Holmes, it is often regarded as the first proper science fiction story, and in a lot of ways, it deserves that thing. But what it actually is well, as is recognized by one of the earlier movie adaptations, the modern Prometheus. It is an iconic encapsulation of an idea of man playing God, the first mad scientist archetype, the modern wizard in a matter of sense. Now, in the book, it takes a very Miltonian theme where Victor Frankenstein, the doctor who created the monster, uh, he has a very incredibly negative reaction when he has a full, almost spiritual realization of what kind of trespass he has done by bringing this creature to life. It's never actually said in spiritual terms, although you could almost see that there was something deeper going on underneath the skin of the context that motivates Victor to make these pronouncements. And indeed, he calls the monster a devil and demon at every other turn of the book. But the Promethean theme is more often associated in the movies, where he seems like a modern Prometheus bringing fire from the gods to mankind,
Which
and
it
bringing
is worth stating that that was the subtitle of the original book, was Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. But yeah,
that
they
that is a fair
the
point. Yeah,
yes, this adaptation definitely leans more into the references to the myth of Prometheus. Like there's what's his name?
Arlander.
Yeah, Harlander. He quotes makes a lot of quotes referring to that. Whereas in the original novel, there was obviously the theme of Prometheus, but there was a lot of inspiration and reference to Paradise Lost. Like one of the most important aspects of that in the original novel was the monster to Victor Frankenstein, the doctor, quotes Adam from Paradise Lost, where he's talking to God about how I didn't ask you to create me, and my misfortune is essentially your fault. So that aspect isn't emphasized in the film as much, even though critics like to say, "Oh yeah, it keeps the Miltonian heart and all that and yada yada," and it does do a good job of capturing the spirit of the book. But I do think the Paradise Lost aspect isn't as emphasized.
No,
There's
it's go
the
ahead.
actual theme of the film where it's less about this creation, the relationship between created and creator. It's actually more a film about daddy issues, which we'll get into. Which,
Oh, the daddy issues.
someone
Yeah.
you could argue that's, the same thing, the relation between creator and created, but it's not exactly the same.
Do we want to get into it this early in the discussion? How effectively this is a Frankenstein written for women?
No, we'll get to that later.
Because I was going to point out that because that touches on the daddy issues thing as well.
Yeah.
But
But
we'll get to that. Yeah.
yes, you had another point you wanted to bring up, though.
It was more or less basically what you said there on the Prometheus angle there and the creator created when you tied that neatly back into the themes of the actual movie itself. Another thing I wanted to talk about is actually the aesthetic and artistic direction of the movie. It's very unique, and I had this realization when the first time we watched the film uh, before we decided to cover for Zeitguys. Is I It's not unrealistic. It's very in keeping with the time period it's set in there, but it's also slightly exaggerated when you see the costumes of the people who attend a noble estate. The caskets of Victor's mother and fathers are being laid to rest, and a few other touches of details there. Even the scientific equipment is properly named and referenced to actual scientific equipment of the era, but it is all stylized and exaggerated only very slightly in a way I haven't really seen in Western media generally, not just in movies, but in anything you could name, TV shows, anime, or whatever. It is very clear Guillermo del Toro has not lost his touch in creating a quite of a visual and aesthetic flair to his movies,
Yeah,
even though it's very subdued.
for anyone who's familiar with any of his other films, like especially Hellboy or Pan's Labyrinth, yeah, even Pacific Rim, which has a more mechanistic feel because it's about the giant robots. When you look at the costumes and the character designs, they also have that signature exaggeration where there's a lot of bright colors, like that. Well, let's not get too much into Pacific Rim, but basically, you can tell it's a Del Toro film, and that's a positive when it comes to the costume and set design. But actually,
It is such a breath of fresh air in modern movie, honestly.
yeah, going to Gallo's point about the scientific equipment and so on, that is, I think, part of why Del Toro moved it forward. Because if it's set in the 1790s, there's limits on what technology there was at the time. Whereas mid 19th century, it's the height of the age of the Industrial Revolution. People are just starting to figure out how electrical power works and all that. And it gives more room to bring in this, because the spirit of Frankenstein is a tale to some extent about, well, obviously trying to play God, but scientific hubris getting too high, flying up to the sun like Icarus. And if you set that in the 1790s, people don't think about that era as a era of great advancement in technology, and that even though it was the prelude to the industrial revolution, as most people think of it throughout the 19th century. And then also in the original book, it isn't real. It Frankenstein is the one narrating the tale, Victor himself. And so when it gets to how he animated the monster, he's like, "Oh, I can't reveal that secret to the world, or other people will try and recreate it." So we never find out how the monster is brought to life in the original book. But Del Toro liked the original Hammer 1931 adaptation of Frankenstein, and that one famously is what introduced. He has the laboratory and he animates the monster with lightning, and that is part of how the monster is animated in this film. And so it was set, nearly 50, 60 years later than the book, so it could incorporate that aspect of focusing on animating the monster with electricity and the advancement of science and all that. Which,
Uh,
yeah, this adaptation definitely goes into even further detail because it talks about how the lymphatic system in the body is key to animation.
in the defense of the authoress's intentions with regarding the book, the circumspection about how the actual secret works. In in the end of the 18th century, before the 19th century, when electricity was first being theorized and worked with, before anything really was done with it or understood, that's what captures Victor's fascination. This is a theme we'll see later on as history and science progresses, is that new scientific technologies are effectively always treated at first as magic in popular media, because when it's purely understood, it effectively is magic by the wider population. And we see this direct comparison in Victor's own education in the original book, where he essentially falls down a rabbit hole of occult esotericism by picking up a book by Agrippa and reading Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus and all this stuff about alchemy and summoning spirits and finding the Philosopher's Stone and elixir of life. He tosses it aside after his tutors teach it, basically convince him it is all rubbish. But it essentially, Shelley makes that direct comparison between the purely understood sheer power of electricity at the time and the ancient magic and alchemy that was sought by the old masters in the Middle Ages and beforehand. We see this later on in the late 20th century, mid 20th century, after the power of the atom was unleashed. Famously, of course, in famous works like Spider-Man and the radioactive spider and all this sort of stuff, when radiation was essentially just used as a literal magic MacGuffin to justify any kind of supernatural abilities or whatever is possible. And later, even the internet or computers, by nature, if you're anywhere near aware of what TV media was like in the 90s, it was often used as a catch-all or a win-all button for anything. Uh, so what we're seeing here is with Frankenstein, the concept of electricity there as a magic substance is used again in this movie, as Al pointed out, when lightning was used to animate the monster. And went even more into the detail of the lymphatic nodes as the actual secret to creating a perpetual life and regeneration, which actually becomes a plot point in the movie once animated by the supernatural power of electricity of the thunderstorm and a lightning strike, where the monster is basically unkillable. Nothing can actually kill it or kill it permanently. He takes gunshots to various parts of the body, he gets blown up. We see his body literally repair itself in real time. It's quite incredible visually speaking, and it just leads to greater appreciation of the film and the nature and the use of the spirit of the what book was written in, both in terms of the purely understood science and what has actually been achieved by Victor.
So, in terms of the actual plot of the film, it follows the same general beats as the actual book and the story everyone thinks of. So it begins where in Victor's childhood, and his mother dies. We move forward a bit. He goes off to university to study science, and then he has the idea to create the monster. This obsession he's been developing essentially from childhood, how to overcome death. He falls in love with Elizabeth, who he meets as an adult here rather than her being his adopted sister or cousin.
Yeah,
And
that was weird in the book. It got hard to follow after a bit.
yeah, anyways, so Victor creates the monster. He ends up regretting it. It's a bit more delayed here than in the book, where he almost immediately regrets it. The monster escapes, goes and learns human language and other things from observing this family. The family discovers him. He is rejected and attacked. And then he goes back to Victor and demands a bride. This doesn't go well. Elizabeth ends up dead. The monster ends up fleeing. Victor tries hunting him down. And they wind up in the Arctic. And Victor is found by a ship on an expedition to the North Pole. He tells the captain of the ship the story. And the monster is there. I mean, the actual ending of the film is significantly different from the book, and it does a lot to change the themes, but we will get into that later. So,
Yeah, that's an entire discussion in itself.
going back to the beginning of the film, this is where we immediately see this is a film about daddy issues. Because, well, in the book, Victor said to have a good relationship with his father, and his father was, all nice and good and whatever. And here, his father is clearly a dark, harsh, controlling figure. And in the first shot where we see him, this is established pretty well. Victor is standing in front of his mother, who's in this flowing red dress with
A
a
veil.
veil. Yeah, a veil that is incredibly long and just blowing in the wind like wings, even.
It, it is very stark, and it immediately catches the attention
Yeah.
because I can't think of any reason or occasion she'd wear something like that at all ever.
Yeah, and then you have the father, and we only see him from behind, and he's wearing this massive black cloak and hat that makes him look like he's just this big, dark, shadowy blob. And we find out he's a surgeon as well, and he's very strict with Victor in his studies to get him to become a surgeon as well. And he hits Victor whenever he is being disobedient or getting questions wrong. And this
Yep.
comes up later because he specifically beats him with a rod, and that'll come up when we get to the monster. And so uh, Victor's mother, she dies in childbirth with Victor's younger brother, who is William, and Victor thinks to himself in the back of his head, did father let her die on purpose because he always resented me and her, or at least that's how he perceives it. And so eventually he confronts his father about this. The father denies it, and that's when Victor decides he's going to conquer death. And so he goes further into his studies, and that his father dies, but he still is obsessively pursuing the secret to life and mastery over death. He goes to the university. We see him demonstra- demonstrating his progress in front of a panel of professors and a bunch of students, and they're dismissive of his ideas. They call it an abomination, unholy, and so on, but Victor's not dissuaded. And at this, Heinrich Harlander, who is a arms manufacturer, uh, he gets Victor's experiment catches his attentions, and he offers to patronize his work. And it turns out Harlander, his niece, is engaged to William, Victor's brother. So Harlander agrees to help fund his research in exchange for a favor, which hasn't been elaborated on yet. And so they go through all the rigmarole of Victor setting up the experiments and trying to create life. and that takes up a good portion of the film. So we'll leave that if you want to watch that. But we find out Harlander has other,
Syphilis.
yeah, okay. I was thinking about whether to spoil that or not. But yes, he has syphilis, and so his body is wasting away. And why he funded this research was so Victor could transport his brain into the body, and then he could live on that way and basically be immortal, because that's the idea here with the monsters, to create the perfect life. And this doesn't go very well. There's a couple mistakes on the actual night where they're creating the monster, and Harlander gets mad because Victor's not agreeing to, put him in the monster because his brain's already infected, so the infection will just affect the monster's body too. And they get into a bit of a scuffle. Harlander ends up falling and dying. And so he's out of the picture now, but the monster is alive. And Victor doesn't immediately disown the monster and flee. He tries to teach it human speech in that, and but all it can do at first is say Victor. That's the only word it knows. And eventually Elizabeth and William come to check on Harlander, who's dead, but they don't know this at the start. And Elizabeth sees the monster and she becomes, I don't
Smitten.
want, no, yes, sure, smitten. It's, yeah,
Just be
perhaps
honest. It's what it is.
that's clearly what it is, the intention for the audience to see. Anyway, she's smitten with the monster in this, and Victor, who, already has a thing for her, is upset about this and the fact that she rejects him anyways before this. And so his increasing frustration with the monster not being able to be learn speech and more complicated things, he ties the monster up and takes a metal rod and starts hitting him like his father used to when he isn't able to do what Victor wants him to do. And
Clearly frustrated of him about after what happened with Elizabeth.
yes, so clearly here we have the very unsubtle parallel of abusive and controlling fathers with high expectations repeated here.
As
And
as
so, yeah,
as
go
well
ahead.
as the unsubtle allegory of the jealous boyfriend. Like I said, written for women.
Yes. So we have actually, no, I'll bring that up later. So Victor considers the whole thing a failure and decides to burn down the laboratory and kill the monster with it. This fails, and the monster gets away. The monster goes and hides in, I believe it was a barn or a shed, and listens and observes this family out in the, uh, in the forest. They live on a farm, and he learns how to speak from them and that while observing them. And then the family leaves, and it's just the blind old man. And he eventually goes in and makes friends and acquaintance with the old man. The old man teaches him until eventually wolves break in one day and kill the old man. The monster kills the wolves, but the family comes back and they think the monster killed the old man. So the monster is attacked. He kills a couple of them and then flees. And he comes back to Victor and demands a wife. And you want to take on this part? Because I know you're interested in the Shape of Water angle, if you know what I mean here, which we'll get to.
Okay, okay. I want to make it clear to the audience that this is not really a critique of Frankenstein. We both enjoyed the movie very much. It is a very good adaptation and a very interesting spin on the tale by Guillermo del Toro. It's a joy to watch. However, it must be said that it's very obvious what the director Guillermo del Toro is doing with the whole monster and the subplot with Elizabeth there.
Basically,
It
if you've seen Shape of Water or any other films that have this kind of, oh, the girl falls in love with the monster thing, it's the same thing here.
It's exactly the same thing here. See, when the monster catches up with Victor again, Victor believes he has been dead when he destroyed the tower he was captured in, and he's currently at his brother's wedding there. He briefly has a conversation with Elizabeth there as she's getting ready in her wedding dress, where he wishes the best for her and his brother there, but she doesn't believe him and says that she only has one thing from him in the future, and that's no more lies. Gives him a slap, and essentially leaves, essentially defeated in life and love, and kind of the lowest point in his life when the monster meets him again in the dark of his own room, or his chamber at least. Uh, but at least he thought that the monster was behind him. Unfortunately, the monster was behind him. And the monster comes in and asks Victor, or rather, browbeats him there by basically saying that his entire existence, everything that Victor tosses to the monster as an insult, can be directly thrown back on Victor as the cause of all this evil, if evil
Which,
it be.
again, we get here into the whole cycles of abuse, daddy issues theme with the film.
Yes, the daddy issues theme there. Because this is essentially the spurned son uh, demanding recognition from his father, which we always see in either coming of age stories or daddy issue stories there. And to use the romanticy angle here, which is at least hinted at, although it's not the main theme of the film, and I'm going to say this honestly, thank God. Uh, it's basically like the heroic monster trying to we see this funny enough in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, where you know the Chad figure, I forget his name, the fellow with the massive muscles, and he confronts the Beast because he believes the Beast took a kidnapped Belle. It's essentially I can't remember, I don't know what the trope's actually called, but essentially a version of that, where the monster, in this case, the child, confronts the father, who's also the monster hunter. And essentially, violence erupts as Victor, quite rightfully, refuses to create a mate for the monster because that would just create a race of the monsters to bedevil the rest of the earth and the population. So he tosses them through several steel bedposts and onto the floor and into a mirror, causing a racket, which brings Victor's brother and Carter Men to the thing, but not before, first of all, Elizabeth is brought to Victor's chambers. And Elizabeth immediately, even though it's her wedding day, she's in her flowing, elegant wedding dress with white ribbons wrapped around her arms, sees the monster, and goes towards her as if starstruck and reaches out and touches his face as if she's desperately in love. Out of nowhere, she's not so much shared 5 words with this creature. It doesn't even have a name, and it clearly doesn't matter. He's clearly just tall, dark, and handsome. That's all that actually matters. And
So
as a
the real
friend of hers,
question here is, would she still love
yeah.
the monster if he was 5'11"?
And of course, we all know the answer to that is no, because clearly, only thing that matters to Elizabeth is the raw physical attraction to the monster. And to be fair
Well,
to the monster design,
the monster's a sensitive young man too, though. We can't forget that.
he is a sensitive young
Because
man.
that is actually one of the things which the film does better than a lot of adaptations is the actual intelligence and kind of philosophical bent of the monster. It's not a mindless zombie, it is a new form of man, essentially. It is intelligent life, and, it starts quoting Milton at Victor in the book. It's obviously smart. So, yes, go on with your
Yeah,
point. Sorry to interrupt.
just a affirmative. Right? He actually learns how to read and reads various books and literature while he's with the blind man in the forest farmhouse, including literally the Bible, the Ozymandias poem, Milton, as you said, and a lot of other things, including I think Arthurian mythology
I
because of knights and dragons.
I do want to add though the Ozymandias one, because that was Percy Shelley, right? So I think that's
Yeah,
a neat little touch because obviously it was his wife Mary Shelley who wrote the original book,
yeah.
and also
That
that actually it's not just the fact it was Percy Shelley. It's the inscription on the statue of the pharaoh Ozymandias Ramesses II. Look upon, my works, ye mighty in despair. And it's about how, his works will last forever and all that. But in the actual poem, we're just seeing the like ruins of it, that fact that time has washed away the supposedly immortal achievement, the hubris of man, which is very much ties in with the whole theme of Frankenstein, where it's about man's hubris and trying to play God.
Yeah, it's a very incredible touch. But just go back to my point there about this is essentially what I mean about this is a Frankenstein written for women. However, I must preface that point that it's not essentially a negative. There's nothing wrong with writing it for women when it doesn't necessarily subvert the plot, and it does not subvert the plot. The themes of the movie are very in keeping with the feel and spirit of Frankenstein, both the original book, the previous movies, and the overall spirit of the Frankenstein movies. The mad scientist, the homunculus creature that he creates, the trespass against God, man, and nature. It keeps all that and wonderfully blends it together. It's just that this romanticy angle is very blatant. It's very pandering. This is Guillermo del Toro's equivalent of Shakespeare putting comedy scenes in his plays that are clearly designed to appeal to the peasants and the plebs more so than the aristocrats he was writing the plays for. He's essentially just writing his movie in such a way to have plot hooks to entice the female audience into the cinema seats. And I'm gonna say it worked because he made The Shape of Water before that, which was explicitly a romanticy movie of, I want to say, kind of disgusting sort, because it's very explicitly just a horrific as sea monster that the woman just falls in love with, and that's what the entire movie is about. Whereas this is just a minor subplot to get their attention.
Yeah.
And as we see with Nosferatu, which we might cover at some point, we haven't decided yet. That angle has also appeared there, but there is actually considered a negative thing, and it's a sacrificial thing the woman does rather than just her loving a monster. She clearly hates the monster, but she has no choice in the matter. But the reaction of women to that movie is telling of how appealing, how easy it is to appeal to women with this sort of angle, and I think it worked.
I mean, one need no look any further than the best selling page for fiction on Amazon or anywhere else and see what sort of romantasy books are, selling like hotcakes. Anyways,
We'll save that. We'll save that for a future episode
yeah,
if we ever have the bravery to cover that.
it's
That's
it's
a whole
not
thing.
a major aspect of the film, so I don't want to linger on it too much. But there was one other thing. We were talking about the whole Miltonian aspect, and when I was giving the summary of the film, I meant to mention this too. But after Victor, his mother dies, he's getting his inspiration to, try and master life. He's praying to the statue of an angel, or no, he has a statue of an angel that he prays to in his room, and he's sleeping, and then he has a dream where the angel comes to life, and it's this bright red angel surrounded by fire, and it essentially imparts the knowledge on him, and he describes it as a dark angel. And that is a
Very very
very
reminiscent of the old esoteric occultism that's hinted at in the books
well.
of being imparted secret, forbidden knowledge by dark angels.
I was gonna say the Meltonian aspect isn't as heavily emphasized in the film, but that definitely, the whole thing with the motif with the angel really gives it that almost Faustian characteristic that is definitely also a in the DNA of the original work, because he's, gaining the knowledge of how to master the world essentially from Mephistopheles.
That is a very interesting comparison there, because what makes Shelley's book, the Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, so unique in this regard, and what makes it the modern sci-fi rather than just the modern Faust, is there's nothing really explicitly supernatural about what's going on. It's clearly like a discovery of scientific reality that has unlocked this horror. Even the modern movies are almost always take this approach, where the supernatural is always referred to but never actually seen or interacted with, unless you count the lightning storm as an act of God when it in the movies when it's used to create to breathe life into the monster, which is a fair interpretation, but it could also be seen as just a natural phenomenon that was just well timed. In that's to distinguish the mad scientist Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, from the doomed alchemist Faust or whatever he was. I forget the actual story of Faust. And that entire thing there, even though it is, as Alary points out, tied up in the DNA of Frankenstein as a clear influence, it's a it's a fascinating look at what the archetype of the mad scientist as not as I said earlier in the podcast, the modern wizard or the modern mad wizard. Uh, but in truth, he is the mad scientist is kind of its own archetype that's just related to the wizard or the arcane alchemist archetype in previous stories and things, but it's clearly its own identity and institution. Well, that's probably the wrong word for it in the term. What would you agree with that, Harry, or?
I'm just checking something technical because we're apparently lagging pretty hard.
Oh, oh, are we okay?
Yeah. So yeah,
Just give us a
just
moment, folks. We're just
yeah.
gonna try to work this out here.
Okay.
Might not be able to do anything about this. I hope this doesn't affect the recording.
Well, the recording it won't because that's uh that has nothing to do with Wi-Fi connection. That's on the actual computer itself. But yeah, it looks like it is just an internet connection issue, which I can't really do anything about. So yes, what was your point?
My point was that the modern mad scientist archetype in fiction, which Frankenstein essentially codifies, is related to, but is probably distinct from the old wizard archetype of previous centuries, even though it's clearly related. Even I made the point itself that it's essentially the modern wizard archetype. But even though
I
I would still say it's separate.
I'm not entirely sure about separate. Like think about how magic figures are presented in these old stories. They're these liminal figures that live on the fringes of society and they, are very eccentric and they themselves also dabble in stuff other people consider forbidden and so on. And they perform wonders that others can't explain. And that's really is both archetypes. So to a T. So I don't know. I think they are essentially the same thing. Manifestations of the same archetype, anyways. Like if you want to split hairs, you can say they're different subtypes of that. But yeah, I do
Well,
think they
definitely
are.
different subtypes of that there, because unlike we always have this the archetype of the good wizards, the archetypical example being Merlin from Arthuriana,
Yeah, but like
but there's no
there's
real archetype of the good scientist, is there?
no. I think there is. You'd need to like give me a moment to think of an example, but I'm sure in films we've had stuff like that. Because I mean, putting on the spur of the moment, I struggle to think of one, but
I,
I'm sure if I describe this, you might be able to think of something like imagine we've got the bad problem, whether it's a natural disaster or some monster, and everything we're doing doesn't seem to have a way to take care of it. But then there's the plucky young scientist who manages to figure it out and has a way to avert the disaster or take down the monster or whatever it is. And he's, a social kind of a social outcast too, you know.
he kind of is, but the plucky young scientist, especially in late 20th and 21st century movies, is less of a wizard archetype and more of a spurned young adventurer hero archetype. Like the young adventurer who hasn't proved himself, who no one really respects or listens to. And a few examples of counter examples of the same person being rather elderly, which is usually the case as well in some movies. I think of one good scientist example is probably the old billionaire from Jurassic Park, the one with the amber topped cane. I
Yeah,
forget his name.
Hammond. I think
Yeah, he
John
probably is
Hammond.
because
Yeah.
yeah, John Hammond, because he just wanted to create something wonderful and miraculous, and he achieved it, and he wanted to keep it all safe. But it's really people who around him who betrayed him. He was essentially just the wizard who was showing his secrets of magic to the world.
I
That's probably an example of the good scientist, I think.
I mean, maybe, but he's still kind of like a Frankenstein figure where it's like he's trying to within the context of the film. I don't know about the original book. He's the whole criticism is again trying to play God and create life and messing with forces he shouldn't. So, yeah, there is a bit more subtlety there in the fact that it's the people around him who cause the disaster, but he's basically letting them exploit his, you know, good aspirations for so which eventually leads to disaster. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but the reason why I consider him the good scientist rather than the mad scientist because disaster isn't really caused by him or his
Yeah.
hubris, even though you're right to point out that it is essentially a modern Frankenstein
I
in what he actually does.
this may be getting a bit esoteric, but part of the whole thing with there not being really the good mad scientists, we can't think of prominent examples from recently anyways, is well, I don't know. I feel like there's gotta be. Okay, this is like an out there example, but like in Metal Gear Solid, Otacon is definitely an example of the good mad scientist, you know?
Okay, I'll give you that, but that definitely is something not everyone in the audience is going to get. Or alternatively, literally everyone in the audience is going to get. Depends. Uh, I will give you that. Although we don't actually see him as a protagonist or anything like that. But then again,
No,
in
but
proper
like
wizard fashion, he's always
you don't see
good.
Merlin as a protagonist in the stories. He's a liminal figure in the Arthurian mythos. Like, sure, he has an important role, but he isn't the protagonist. These figures that we're talking about, like the eccentric wizard or scientist, they can be, like in the case of Frankenstein, but generally they've traditionally been either antagonistic forces or supporting characters if they're in a positive role. Um,
That I was about to concede that point before you eloquently put it there. That
yeah,
is fair, and I guess Otacon does really fill that supporting role of the good wizard or the good
yeah,
mad scientist in this
yeah.
case.
That might be a bit of an obscure, well, I don't think it's too obscure, but hopefully, people in the
But it's
audience
only
can think of
obscure.
their own examples.
It's only obscure in the sense that we took us so long to think of such a
A ship that's on an exploration to the North Pole. They find Victor, they pick him up, and then we get Victor telling his story. And then Victor tells his story. The monster comes back and is like, all right, you told your story, now I'm going to tell mine. And then we get the monster's perspective. And then after that, we return to the present where both Victor, the monster, are on the ship. And then, just for comparison, in the book, we get similar, where it's letters from the captain of the ship to the North Pole expedition, who's English in that, but that's a minor detail. He's writing letters to his sister back home and tells her about how he found Victor and that, and so on. And then we get his Victor essentially dictates to the captain of the ship his story and all that. And then near the end of the book, we come back to the captain's own narration. So it's a nice parallel to the way the book does it, where we're not just getting out of context narration. There is a framing to it, which a lot of older novels did. Whereas now you'll just get a, a third person omniscient narrator who doesn't have anything to do with the story, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a difference in style. But yes, back to the film. After Victor and the monster tell their stories, they're in the captain's cabin, and they actually manage to. Well, do you want to describe the Scalo?
Eh, After they both tell their tales and essentially air their grievances of the captain there essentially being the
Sorry, Gallo, you cut out
device
there.
in. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, the captain being.
The captain being essentially the neutral judge, erstwhile neutral judge, whereas actually in the Freeman device, it was actually the narrator of the initial letters of the book who was the judge, listening to Frankenstein's monster tell his tale of how he regrets killing Victor. The narrator in that book, in the book, calls bullshit in this. The monster gives one final justification or elucidation of like how terrible he feels before jumping out the window into the night. In this, the captain merely watches on, doesn't really comment as Victor reaches out and touches the monster's hand, essentially asking the monster for forgive him for what he has done to him, the harm he's done to the monster, and asks him to essentially give him his name back. There's a whole thing where Victor was the monster's
Yeah,
first
when we're
ward, and
describing the film's ending, keep the theme of like generational trauma and abuse of controlling fathers in mind, because that's clearly an important undertone to the scene. So go on. Yes.
so it's essentially the second confrontation between the spurned son and seeking the recognition of the father, and where the father on
Yes.
his deathbed recognizes his son for the first time,
Yes.
essentially, which is essentially what
And gives him his name. So
and
that's
gives him his name.
yeah.
So he's now Victor Frankenstein, son of Victor Frankenstein,
Yeah.
Victor Frankenstein. So he's the monster essentially, canonically, Victor Frankenstein the third. Uh, the monster does give his father Victor his forgiveness essentially, and Victor essentially dies in peace after all the trauma and awful woe of the movie, the deaths of Elizabeth and his brother and all the men and women and everything else that was caused by the monster, who was essentially who was caused by Victor himself. So Victor is as is lucid in the book, the cause of all the woe and anguish that the monster himself is resultant of. So by forgiving the monster, he heals the generational trauma and essentially stops the generational trauma from repeating itself, ending the cycle, which you see literally all the time in media. We see it in cartoons, we see it in TV shows, we see it in movies. It's the only thing that seems to matter to writers anymore is trauma and anxiety. Uh, and I'm personally kind of bloody sick of it. But to get back into the whole written for women angle, this would desperately appeal to the female audience in the thing here, because it redeems the Victor Frankenstein, who himself is played by an attractive male figure. And this must be said that despite the fact that Guillermo del Toro, God bless him, doesn't hold back from the fact that the monster is monstrous, literally stitched together from pieces of different corpses. The actual sculpture of the skull shape and the facial features of the monster and the long flowing black hair is actually, if you put a coat of fresh skin over him, would actually be appealing to most women.
You
So
have such a
he's very.
cynical view of things.
I'm actually bringing to a point here. That's also kind of hinted at in Shelley's book, actually, where the creature was defined at least before Victor woke him up with the experimentation and had his whole change of heart towards the monster and viewed him as devilish and demonic. Strong of limb, long flowing black hair, and fine of features. The creature was described as weirdly handsome, despite being clearly horrific. And that's where Guillermo del Toro, at least aesthetically, in Grabs the Monster, is actually in keeping very faithfully to the book, both in spirit and theme, and in this case, quite directly in description. But knowing what I've said previously about Guillermo del Toro, we know what you're doing, dude. We know why you made these decisions.
We've seen Shape of Water. We know what you're doing.
We know what you're doing, man.
Yeah.
And like I said, there's nothing essentially wrong with writing it for women, especially when it doesn't actually subvert the movie, and it doesn't. It leans into all the themes of the movie. It's just very noticeable. It's very much like Shakespeare's cutaways to please the plebeian audience. It's very, I don't want to say lowbrow because it's not lowbrow because it's disjointed, I suppose I would say. It's very, it takes you out of it whenever it happens.
It can. But yes, to give contrast for those who haven't read the book or aren't familiar with it, Victor dies at the end, and it's not. I don't recall it because it's been a long time since I read it. If it's directly stated that the monster killed him, or if it's just implied. Well, I
It's
mean,
implied, but the narrator
in
clearly blames it for the death.
well, okay, let's actually go back there. The monster clearly killed Victor, directly or indirectly, whether it was from his obsession with pursuing the monster that like led him all the way to the North Pole and destroying his health, or whether the monster physically killed him directly. His creation ended up killing him, and
Mhm.
there's no reconciliation, and so that is obviously a very radically different conclusion from the film. And like Gallo said, I don't think that's necessarily a question of which is better, so much as it is a matter of taste, because they are. While it is probably the most faithful adaptation in spirit to the original work, it does take a lot of liberties and is telling a different message with the same story.
Yeah, it definitely is, as we've copiously pointed out there. And it's not necessarily wrong. It's very good adaptation in that regard, as long as you know what you're getting into there. And we do recommend it because
Yes.
it's not done in any kind of mean spirited there. It's clearly written by someone who loved the book or loved all the things that came from Frankenstein.
Yeah. Like
So
Del
go
Toro
ahead.
liked the book himself, and he was also a fan of the 1931 film, as we said. But he during the interviews related to the press releases for the film and all that, he talked obsessively about the what he liked about the various other adaptations, what he didn't like so much, and would be trying to, bring more in line with his vision and his own take on the film. So yes, it's someone who clearly likes the source material, unlike a lot of adaptations of things nowadays, where it's someone who clearly hates it or just doesn't care for it and is essentially just
Sometimes
doing a job.
or sometimes even proudly announces he never read, played, or watched the original source material,
Yes, which happens very frequently. So
including one of the Harry Potter movies of all things to not cover the source material on.
yeah. Anyways, the is there anything? Well, we'll open it up to questions now. If anyone in the audience is got any, but is there anything else you want to discuss with the film, Gallo? Any other points to raise or address?
No, we covered the major things there. I just really love the aesthetics and feel of the movie. This is more or less something to do with general movie making and filmography in the modern day and anything. Incredibly excellent use of lighting, shadow, contrast, color, and everything else there. There I don't need to tell the audience how eternally boring and poorly used filters are in modern filmmaking.
More gray. And how about yellow piss filter? Because it's set like in Mexico or something.
Or brown, brown,
Oh yes,
brown,
The past is always has the brown filter over it, or the gray one.
yeah. It's just The Matrix did a lot of things, but using the green filter for sense of unreality at least had a purpose in that film rather than just lazy way to set the mood and tone of the location.
And another thing is costume design is a increasingly difficult thing to good costume design is increasingly difficult to find in films nowadays. Whereas in
We are
here,
ru- we are we are routinely seeing just budget cosplayers at comic cons around the world,
with better
fucking.
Costumes,
Yeah,
yeah.
just putting entire $1 million Hollywood and TV productions to absolute shame.
Yeah.
Anyone who loved the Witcher game and book series and watched the Netflix adaptation knows exactly what I am talking about in regards to that. Need I bring up the Nilfgaard army's armor or the Rings of Power and how it designs its armor for
I I
the
do think
Numenorians?
the most relevant example right now is Christopher Nolan's forthcoming Odyssey adaptation, where it literally looks like they just bought you know, Greek hoplite costumes from Halloween City or something.
It yeah, it very much does. Like even Troy, the old movie Troy, which has a lot of people fair criticisms to be made about it in terms of historicity and aesthetics and design, was far more faithful to both the feel and look of the period than this movie's turned out to be.
Yes. So to bring it back, Del Toro's Frankenstein, in contrast, has very interesting costume design and it's very visually stunning. And if you just were to watch the film with it unmuted without subtitles, you'd still probably get a pretty entertaining experience just from the spectacle. Because
Yeah.
we, when people talk about films and review them online, tends to just be mainly talking about the story, which is of course important. But film is a very visual medium, and I feel like a lot of films nowadays don't really care about visual storytelling as much. Yes, there will be like the big action blockbusters where they emphasize the spectacle as in just big, flashy explosions and action scenes that are 90% CGI. But this film is a good example of uh, more subtle visual storytelling where, like, we talked about the scene where Victor's father is introduced. That scene, that shot tells you a lot just from looking at it. No dialogue needs to be exchanged. Already
Just from
tells
sheer
you the relation
just from
between Victor, his mother, and their father, and his father.
Yeah, just from sheer direction alone, it tells it there. Because not only does Hollywood and most modern film and TV media not even bother visual storytelling, or it is doesn't seem to be aware of it as a concept. It's very often just bad storytelling as well in general in most of these stories. Sadly enough, whereas Guillermo del Toro, he's clearly a luminary and have been around the block for like decades at this point. He knows his craft.
Yeah,
Because in truth, filmmaking is a craft, and a craft requires a craftsman with experience and secrets and tricks of the trade and all that. Whereas most people nowadays just treat it as a kind of factoring job. You just put a bolt in B slot and shove the product out the door. And I feel that's
which
a lot of industries nowadays.
that is basically every artistic industry nowadays. It's all very by the numbers. Like a committee came up with the piece of art as it is, and this is,
Yeah.
it's from film to video games to music, especially, and visual arts as well. Like, you don't really see people talk about paintings or anything nowadays, but even just the everyday art that you'll see on advertisements and that, it feels very stale and all that, which is, again, a reason why we are doing this podcast, is to help promote independent creatives who actually have a vision and a passion for whatever their respective craft is. And we would like to help promote them and network them with other artists. So if anyone has any suggestions for guests we could have on or other topics we could cover, we'd be very grateful if you would send those our way. Either leave a comment here or a DM on our Twitter account, Zeitguys, or
It'd
anything
be much, or even
else.
or even a comment anywhere you could see us there.
Yeah.
It'd be greatly appreciated because we do enjoy those interviews and promoting those products there.
Yes.
Both because well, it's just pure fun, generally speaking, and it is the essential reason to tear of their entire this entire project,
Yeah,
as
that
Harry pointed out.
yes, that's our main thing here is the interviews. So yes, is there anything else from you, Gal?
No, I think we covered that there. Like, mostly what's interesting about the movie is how it touches on other things. Like, we branched off on several diatribes here that went away from the movie itself before coming back to it.
Yeah.
I think that it's a thought provoking movie in that regard. If you've read the material or are familiar with the filmography of Frankenstein and all that, but it's definitely a piece of art. I praise it as a finely crafted movie, and it is. I wouldn't say it's a great movie, but then again, it can't really be because it would have to be better than the classic Frankenstein movies, and you can't really unseat the OGs
Well,
essentially.
I do think it probably is the best Frankenstein film, actually.
Think.
I mean, yeah. Um, it's been a while since I watched the other ones, but I kind of feel like this one does the best job of capturing the spirit and spectacle, but it is kind of limited by its runtime and well, I don't know if I necessarily want to say that, but I think the whole theme of daddy issues and reconciliation between father and estranged son. That's
Yeah.
it is a good theme and thing to tackle, but I don't feel it's quite as hard as the more grand question in the original Frankenstein of man's relation to God and to his own creation. I feel that
Yeah, it
that's
it
a bit
doesn't
more
know.
grand, and you can take that to more a deeper level of thought about life in general. Whereas we get the whole trauma stories all the time now. Like you said, that seems to be the only theme people tackle anymore, and it's not a bad theme. It's just it feels overdone nowadays.
Overplayed, and there's nothing else that he really tackles
Yeah,
or it. Yeah,
and it is inherently kind of a limited theme. That's what I was trying to get to with the thing about the original Frankenstein and it tackling relationship between created and creator, because personal stories obviously are tend to be very emotionally engaging in that, but there is some limit about what they can say about the human experience as a whole because they're really only focusing on one aspect, one facet.
yeah. It has to do with the whole. I don't want to blame women for this, but
I
kind of
think you've
yeah.
done a lot of that already this episode.
It's just that the tendency in modern storytelling across the board, films, TV, cartoons, especially novels and modern literature, and we'll get to the whole modern publishing house fiasco. Believe me, that's an entire thing on itself. Is the grand themes that Alahari was talking about that the original book tackles very well and seems to be a bit lacking in this adaptation doesn't really appeal to that audience as well as audience that have been raised in a material male and female because it doesn't feel as personal. That's why it seems to be focusing on personal trauma themes and a lot of this media, because that seems anyone can interrelate to whatever their personal trauma is. It's like, oh, that person has suffered trauma and has reacted to it with anxiety. That's just like me, for real, no cap.
This is also um, this is just a thought, but I think also the specific trauma here of like the controlling, overbearing father isn't necessarily well, like if you look at people of our generations, Gen Z and millennials, I think that archetype is less present than is a kind of a more ambivalent or father who's busy with other things and you know
The absent father rather than
The
the abusive father.
absent rather than overbearing father, I feel like is a more prevalent archetype of what people's experience. Well, it's a more common experience among people of our generation. So I think that's also an aspect as to why it doesn't. It feels, it's not. It's kind of stale, maybe a bit. I mean, people I'm sure still have those experiences, but
Oh yeah,
it's a
people
very
definitely have
it's a
enjoyed
very
it.
old story. Like you can think a lot of 70s, 60s, 80s films that had a whole theme of the overbearing, controlling father.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, more or less. That's what I mean. Why you could talk forever about this Frankenstein and how it touched on other things, rather than essentially criticizing the movie itself, because we're not criticizing it. But
Yeah.
otherwise, I don't really currently have any extra points at the moment. Do
Right.
you?
No, well, in that case, I know we had some technical issues, so apologies to those of you who are watching the stream live, but it should all be fine on the recording. So thank you to everyone who's watched, and please let us know if you have any other suggestions. And if you would, please subscribe to our channel here and follow us on Twitter so you can keep up to date with our interviews and projects. And if that is all, then we will all see you next time for whatever we tackle next.
Yes, and just signing off myself there. Thank you for coming to hear us have this discussion. It's been lovely having you all.
Yes, goodbye.